Hi, dear listeners. This is Kate Riga. I'm here to make a quick pitch that you consider becoming a TPM Prime member. TPM has used the member model for over a decade now, and our loyal members are the only reason we've been able to weather the turbulence of the media landscape and avoid the fate that has befallen so many other independent outlets. For $70, you get no paywall, fewer ads, access to the Hive member forum, a members only newsletter, and more. For $140 a year, you get all of that, plus no ads at all. Without our members, there is no podcast, not to mention that I'm out of a job. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We couldn't do it without you.
Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga. This is our first episode after the vice presidential debate. We had that last night. Kind of like with a lot of vice presidential debates, there's not like a huge amount of buildup because, you know, we know there's it doesn't seem to be a lot of consequence to them. Debates themselves, presidential debates, often don't have a huge amount of consequence. It might have had one this year. I don't know. I think it's always a little hard to know. But vice presidential debates don't tend to have a lot, and this is a case where I feel like probably most people thought that both of them would do okay, right? I mean, it's with both Trump and Biden for maybe related but different reasons. Like you don't know what's going to happen, right? The sky's the limit. But both these guys sort of isn't sky's the limit. I think the general verdict was that Vance probably helped himself some, seeming more normal than people probably expected. That's a low bar to meet. It's funny. I have definitely heard from some people who either were watching the debate with kind of a non-politically tuned in person, or maybe one of these focus groups and something like that. And I get the sense that some people still saw Vance as kind of, I don't know, a little used car salesman-y, a little slick. Uh, that's probably right. I mean, I think for most political people, and I would certainly include myself in this, I don't even try to sort of imagine what I'm just not a good judge of these things. I can sort of try to approximate, but my sense is Vance, I think, did a relatively good job trying to kind of take the hard edges off almost everything that they stand for, often just like lying. I mean, for me, the most I have a lot of experience with Republican lying. It does not surprise me, right? But I must say, even I was a little taken aback and sort of gobsmacked by the whole line about, you know, Obamacare was falling apart and Trump saved it. And he brought everybody together on a bipartisan basis to save Obamacare. So if you have Obamacare, you should thank Donald Trump. I mean, I don't know quite where to go with that. I mean, that's so absurd. I really don't even know where to start. So I do think, well, as I said, often just these sort of absurd lies. But one thing that, and I haven't seen a lot of commentary on this yet, but it stuck out to me, and I thought it was kind of revealing. Given the opportunity to defend the mass deportation, we're gonna set up camps and mobilize local law enforcement to kick 10 or 12 million people out of the country. He didn't defend it at all. He basically just pretended it didn't exist. He basically said, yeah, whatever. But we're just gonna we're gonna kind of zero in on people who killed people, and I think we can all agree that we should make them leave. Zero in on the criminals. And I mean, okay, I mean, we already deport people, right? Uh, if you are a undocumented immigrant, in fact, even if you're a documented immigrant, if you commit any sort of serious crime, you serve your time and then you're out. That's how it works. So again, that was striking to me, that was just sort of abandoned, and that's kind of a in some ways that's the central point in their whole campaign. And I did think that that was an example of something that I think you can see in this debate, which is that I get the sense JD Vance was at least in part thinking about, it's sort of like when a marriage is ending, one of the people starts to kind of like, get in shape, get a new wardrobe, looking forward to the next, go in the market again, your next opportunity. Because I do think he came off trying, kind of reasonable, blah, 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 blah. So that was my sense overall. You know, Tim Walz, you wouldn't call him the smoothest debater, I think, right? You wouldn't call him a used car salesman because he's not gonna make the sale on the car. He was sort of uh, bumbly through a lot of it, and yet he hit the points that I think they wanted him to make, talking about these women dying because of Trump abortion bans in their state. Um, there were just in general, I thought the first half of the debate probably went to Vance. Second half of the debate, uh, on the one on abortion, the one on health care, especially the one on democracy. Not even sure, it wasn't like Waltz like slam dunked him or anything. But and JD was kind of like, oh, healthcare, like yeah, we invented Obamacare. If you like it, thank Donald Trump. And on the abortion ban, he's saying states, but my general sense is just by the end of them, you're like, dude, no, like you're in the wrong side of public opinion here, and you're kind of doing your best shot at it, but Walz got in his points, and then there's that big thing at the end where it was Walz who asked, "Did Donald Trump lose the election? What happened?" And that kind of telling moment where JD Vance says, "Oh, I'm let's not look to the past, let's look to the future." And that kind of tells you that the big lie is the central, it's like the centerpiece of Republican ideology. You have to, when called on, you have to lie again. You cannot say Donald Trump lost that election because Donald Trump is everything. So, I don't think it's going to have a huge impact. Like on the kind of in the debate itself, I thought it was about a draw. But I do think in some ways that the takeaways, the post debate takeaways, may kind of hurt. Like it may actually be a slight win for the Harris campaign, just because it's I think the things that are going to kind of stick around, maybe generate a few news cycles, are going to be uh, things that are not helpful to Donald Trump. So, Kate, what's your were you less nervous? Because I know in the previous debate you were you were quite on pins and needles, or whatever the tenterhooks in the lead up.
Yeah. I wasn't nervous about this one at all. I kind of went in thinking that JD was gonna be far better than Tim Walz and that it probably wouldn't matter. JD just has the debate me guy thing, the like Ted Cruzian, I was on the debate club and at Harvard type vibe. So that coupled with the fact that they started softening the ground for Walz's debate performance when he was initially chosen as the vice president. Like, unless you imagine that they're doing some kind of crazy 4D chess. You don't put out there like, oh man, he's not the best debater. And then he hits the stage and is like the best debater anyone's ever seen. I thought that was like pretty unlikely. So
Yeah.
I thought that they would be somewhat mismatched in this debate. And I also just thought, how could this possibly matter? Like, if an assassination attempt didn't move the polls, if Harris's kind of commanding performance in a debate that everyone thought was going to be really important didn't move the polls, like, I don't think the undercard debate is going to really kind of move the needle. And I thought that was mostly borne out. Like you said, Walz is a much less fluent speaker than Vance is. His kind of default to affability meant that he just is much more inclined to kind of do the like, we're all pals here, we agree more than we disagree, which can kind of make you want to pull your hair out, but we know that people who don't care about politics really like that stuff. I think most importantly, Vance's worst moments were on important topics, and I think Walz's worst moments were on unimportant ones. Like, he had the kind of difficulty with the timeline of when he was in China, which I'm sure the right wing is going to go crazy about, but there's just no world where anyone's going to care about that.
Well, even if you think it means that Tim Walz is like a serial China timeline liar, like, okay, like who cares, right?
Yeah, what's the
Doesn't matter.
constituency for that,
Yeah,
right?
who cares?
Whereas the only clip that I saw organically from the debate was that's a damning non-answer on the January 6th thing, which, by the way, I think you can make the argument that Walz was over-prepared. It seemed at time that he was kind of like struggling to get in his talking points, but the debate prep to arm him with that's a damning non-answer when they knew that JD Vance wouldn't answer the question was really good, really perfect, I think, and succinct. And the Harris campaign already has at least a digital ad up with that moment from the campaign. So I kind of came away with similar conclusions as you. I think.
Can I say just one thing about that one moment that like even more than like that was the damning comment. If I recall, the moderators got it, kind of got it near to January 6th, the big lie, and then it was Walz who kind of in that moment said, "Okay, but what do you think?" Like they didn't ask him point blank, and again, sort of like, kind of like I was saying before, he was sort of like stumbly and kind of not great, except he hit his points. And
right.
as you say, that's what matters, right? That's the viral clip.
Yeah, exactly. And something I found interesting was in the kind of post-debate reactions, grain of salt, these are generally focus groups with like 5 people in them, but it's our only real sense of how quote unquote normal people feel because most quote unquote normal people did not watch. So we're kind of like stuck with whoever was in a focus group. But the kind of like flash polls like split somewhat evenly. There's a clip of, I don't know, one of the networks had a group of like 5 or 6 people who most of them thought like Walz better.
Yeah, I think it was NBC.
And it made them, they said they made them more inclined to vote for Harris. Then you have the little polls of like, did this change your mind? And everyone's like, no. So, it's kind of, that's the mix, right? And I think it's just really telling that even kind of coming off a performance where I think most people would say Vance at the very least is kind of a more able presenter and is kind of rhetorically quicker on his feet, that still for the kind of normies who watched, they were like evenly split. And a lot of them kind of liked Walz better, even though he was a more, he bungled his performance a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of both at the same time. I mean, sort of like, as I said, like Walz was sort of, not smooth, not fluid in his answers, kind of, it's funny. Everybody talks about, the avuncular, kind of the coach, the nice uncle. He did have that sense, kind of, certainly he was nervous at the beginning. There's no question about that. And he is, look, like kind of like going right to the major leagues here, right? I mean, Harris, it's her first presidential debate, but she did a vice presidential debate. She's been vice president. Walz was kind of a backbencher member of the House and then governor, but of a medium to small size state. Um, uh, you know, he wasn't great, and as you said, Vance was slicker. But again, he sort of I almost at one point talked about it like a word fugue, right? that in the second half of the debate, as I recall it, was basically um, healthcare, abortion, and democracy. I can't remember exactly the order. Democracy was last, I think. But like on the abortion one, you have Vance kind of make all his arguments that are sort of well presented, but don't make a lot of sense. And then Waltz gets in there and says yada yada yada, word fugue yada, and then says, "Remember this woman?" Says her name. She had drive 600 miles and she died. And you hear that and you're like, oosh. Like most of us who are immersed in politics, we know those stories, but they wanted to, for anybody who hasn't heard yet, here's the story. So he hit those marks, and the kind of, that's how it
Yeah.
is.
In a similar vein, one of the most interesting moments from Vance, I thought, was the Republican Party needs to earn back the country's trust on reproductive issues thing. Because in some ways it's not novel at all, right? Like we have gone through phases where Republicans have sought to kind of soften the edges of that stuff, and they'll do it with like, you'll have Nancy Mace introduce a like help poor mothers bill, and then it dies in Congress and doesn't go anywhere. But they occasionally do try to do this kind of correction stuff where they know it's not going down easy, and they try to soften the edges in various ways. So in that way, this wasn't new, but really well packaged. I thought the kind of admission of wrongdoing hits more powerfully when you're on a ticket with Trump, whose entire ethos is never apologize for anything.
Mm-hmm,
um
mm-hmm.
but that being said, even that, which would probably be the moment that I would be most worried about kind of coming out of this debate, there's just such a mountain of data that you have to get people to put aside to kind of buy that argument. And, the same way as the kind of Nancy Mace bills to nowhere, you can't make good on that promise in any tangible way without pissing off the base, right? Like we've seen this from Trump try to do a tight walk of like, it's to the states. I'm going to leave it at that. Like, stop talking to me about this. And it doesn't work. Like you can't make anti-abortion absolutism that big a part of your brand and then be like, but not really though. Like we did get the
Yeah.
constitutional right taken away, but like it's fine. We're chill on the issue.
Yeah, there was I mostly had it's the same impression that you have about that interchange. But when I was listening to it, and again, he made the argument well in the sort of the in the structure of that argument. But I think what he came to towards the end is giving women more choices, more this, more that. And clearly in the vein of more choices, he means these crisis pregnancy centers that in theory will arrange an adoption and kind of fund you during your pregnancy and all that stuff, child tax credit, all that stuff. But I was struck, and I think he used the word choice, because like it as I listen to it, it's sort of working so well and giving women more choices. And if I, to the extent that I can, which I think is pretty limited, could sort of put myself in the mode of a woman listening to that, I would kind of say, can we start with like choice? Like, why don't you just go with abortion, since that's what we're talking about, right? It kind of, I don't know, it kind of and there was part of me that wanted Walz to voice that, because it was sort of to your point, going so perfectly for him in the structure of that argument. But I feel like we're kind of past that now. Like everybody, like kind of like it's not 20 years ago when, the sort of the Clintonite, what was it, rare, they had
Safe,
that,
legal, and rare.
yeah, safe, legal, and rare, where everybody agrees, like it's just a tragedy when this has to happen, but we need to create the choice and stuff. Um, I think that, and people, a lot of people today beat up on Clinton and the Clintonites about that line, but it's important to remember they didn't come up with that line out of nowhere. That was more kind of where the country was on that issue. And, we can probably disagree with that. But again, the country was in a different place. There was still this, I don't know how you'd put it, this a significant slice of the electorate that is, we don't want it to be banned, but let's not talk about it, and let's try not to have it happen a lot and stuff like that. But that's not where the country is now. There's sort of a decisive majority that says it just has to be available. And that's it.
And that sees the anti-abortion movement a lot more clearly than we used to. It's a lot less kind of, well, this is their strongly held conviction, and a lot more of, this is rendering women less than full adults. That's just much more in the bloodstream now. And I think, just the problem is JD Vance and the party will not make good on anything that I think would actually soften people to their abortion stance. Like if you did something like a huge expansion of the child tax credit, right, coupled with, I don't know, free money to kind of women who have new babies and stuff, maybe that would move the needle, but they will never in a million years do that. And that's what always happens, right? There's this push of, we need to be seen being kinder to new mothers to kind of make the harshness of this stance palatable to people. But then they refuse to ever kind of give money to poor people in that way. So it always falls apart. And then you're left with what we've had for a long time, what you mentioned, this infrastructure of kind of fake abortion care where you have crisis pregnancy centers, or like Amy Coney Barrett being like, well, aren't safe haven laws enough? And those things have been in the mix for forever. And people do not buy that those kind of little propaganda tentacles are helping women in any meaningful way, much less on the scale that you would have to kind of make such an absolute abortion stance humane in any kind of way. So I just think its traction is going to be limited. Like, this is an issue, as you say, the country has moved on, and just Democrats own it, right? I mean, what are you going to do? You would have to go back and undo Dobbs. Like, that was the death knell on this issue.
Yeah, it's funny because there is, to the point you're making, there certainly was in the mainstream political conversation relatively few elected officials wouldn't say something like, look, it's a complicated issue. It's a very complicated, but precisely because it's complicated, you just need to leave this to a woman, and her doctor. You can't you can't intrude on that relationship. And there is certainly still that it's between a woman and her doctor. But and this is even still striking to me because I remember that earlier politics in the 1990s, that you don't have it's complicated. You have even, politicians who even now find it a little surprising. Just like, yeah, a woman's got to be able to have an abortion if she needs an abortion. That's just the end of the story. Sorry. And it is interesting because definitely, part of that thing in the 90s was that for the first, I don't know, for the first 20 years or so after Roe, it was semi outside of politics because it wasn't it was not it was obviously a political issue, but you couldn't make a law on it. And so there was this period of time when a lot of Democrats and a decent amount of Republicans, because it wasn't so polarized along partisan lines, supported it, but they didn't want to talk about it or make like an affirmative case for it. Obviously there were a lot, but they were not the sort of the majority of elected Democrats. They were kind of like, okay, support it, but let's not talk about it exactly. And so that, the whole safe what and rare? Safe, what is it again?
Legal.
Safe, legal, and rare was part of that. Was that at that point that was sort of created to allow sort of mainstream elected Democrats to kind of have a slogan, like we're gonna talk about it now. But yeah, I feel like, I mean, it's interesting because, and I don't know the exact details on this, but my understanding is, and I think this is accurate, that the limits on abortion in Europe for how many weeks, in many cases, are tighter than they are in the United States. But the difference is that as long as you are within that window, there's no nonsense about having to go to the clinic 10 times and all of these. It's just available as a medical service. And so the whole sort of structure of it is different. And I do think Republicans could have managed something like you're describing a decade ago, certainly 20 years ago, but now the horses left the barn.
The European gestational limits also almost always have exceptions, like this would cause economic hardship or, psychological pain. So that's a piece too. But yeah, no, so I think what could have been maybe Vance's best moment is tempered just by the reality. Like, I don't know that there's any amount of rhetorical slickness that can kind of get you out of where the hole that Republicans have dug on abortion. And then, contrasting to that, Walz's best moment was, as we discussed briefly, the damning non-answer on January 6th. And that's a really good moment to have go well for him, right? Like to have Vance up there just refusing to say who won the election. I think that's something that probably the only thing that'll come out of this debate is going to be that moment. And I think there's a chance that it does kind of bounce around because it's got the trappings of an interesting gotcha moment, right? Because Walz asked it instead of the moderators, and Vance tried to duck, like, he looked really political because he wouldn't answer the question, and Walz had this great quippy response that just kind of encapsulates the sliminess and the danger of that whole thing. And I think Walz knew it because he went out to get pizza after the debate and reporters followed him and asked him what his best moment was. And he said, the kind of democracy bit at the end. So I think that moment went really well. And so many of the other exchanges were really dense and they were trying to talk really quickly and in a way that is just kind of anathema to clips and quick kind of video bits that are what circulate. I really was and continue to be struck by how much, even if you didn't really, given this is my social media environment, so it's very politically, tilted. But after the Kamala Trump debate, you didn't even really have to kind of seek out clips. They were just everywhere because there was a lot of those. And part of this is just because her commanding performance, right? But there was a lot of kind of good soundbitey moments. And I think this debate was nearly devoid of them accepting the January 6th moment, which sucks for Vance.
I totally agree. And, part of that was that both of them, and again, I think this would drive partisans crazy. I admit it drove me kind of crazy. The constant falling over themselves, like, "Oh, I love you. You go, queen." Right? All
So
the sort of,
funny.
this sort of like shout outs to each other that they were both doing. Right. So that kind of undermined things that might have potentially been a bit viral, right? If one person says something
Totally.
and, kind of yada, yada, yada. And I'm sure you agree with this because you're a good man, JD, or thank you for saying that, Tim. Because no, in the universe of virality, no one wants to hear that shit, right?
No,
That's not what viral is. I don't know.
totally.
I'm curious what you thought of this. My when so Walls asks him who won the election. JD says what he says, and my sense of what because and then Walls seemed to hesitate for a moment, and then he said, "What did he say? A very damn it. What were the
He
actual words
said,
he said?"
well, that's a damning non-answer.
Right. Okay. So it seemed to me when I watched him, maybe his timing is just really good, but he seemed to pause for a second and need to think it through, and almost like I didn't get the sense that he had rehearsed. That's a very damning not answer. That seemed to be, what's that word they have in the law? Not an extemporaneous comment. The excited comment. There's a thing where what is it? You get out of like the hearsay exception if it's something someone says.
Oh, an excitable utterance, is that it? It's
Something
something
like
like
something
that,
like
yeah.
that. Yeah, that something is a little more genuine if you say it in the moment without planning it. And my sense was it was a little like that because he if I recall, he didn't even say it to the camera. He was just sort of like doing his own play-by-play. Well, that's a pretty damning non-answer. Yeah, okay, damning non-answer. I don't know. Maybe it was a little more rehearsed than I thought, but that was my sense. And as you say,
Yeah,
that's the viral moment.
I suspect it was because I don't think in a debate you ask a question that you're not prepared for any answer they might give. But no,
Hmm.
it was really good. That moment was really good. And I just think we're all paying attention to this because we're political junkies and we're all really nervous. And this is like the last scheduled thing on the calendar. And I actually think that last point is what gives it any feeling of import at all. Because if you're still trying to kind of exert control freak energy on this election, you're like, well, this is the last chance for things to kind of take a significant turn.
Right,
Even though,
right,
of course, we know that's not true, right? And the reality of what decides elections are way more mysterious and thus scarier than that. But we are now at this weird precipice where it feels like everything is just driving towards the election, but the levels of uncertainty are so high that you're trying to grasp at things that will make a difference and that will influence the people who have to who get to decide, but it's such a weird stew and there are all these countervailing factors and the polling is kind of all over the place and we have all these kind of mysteries about things that were once conventional wisdom that you feel uncomfortable applying to this election because everything about it has been so strange and unusual. So it's weird because we're almost like in a quote unquote lull, kind of, but where you have to be kind of constantly worried about late breaking atmospherics, right? A New York Times dog pile on a Harris gaffe in the last 2 weeks, or another natural disaster in a swing state, or one of the kind of foreign adversaries who want Trump to be elected trying to kind of stir things up, which feels like it's already happening. So I don't know. We're at this weird time where it's kind of the calm before the storm, but it's, I guess, just the anxiety before the storm.
yeah. I mean, there is, it's funny because there's the the polls are all over the place in the sense that there are various polls pointing to different things. But if you look at the averages, and in this case, I'm not saying here the averages are right or predictive or whatever, but they're a set of the averages. In some cases, they're just, people doing just simple averages. In the other cases, the models, they kind of, intersperse national polls and state polls and sort of adjust them against each other. But in each case, it is a predetermined set of rules that you pour the polls into and you read something out. And those have actually been surprisingly static, right? I mean, there are kind of outliers in one direction or another. But again, if you look at those averages, you look at them over time, they're remarkably static. If anything, they really seem to show, a very slight movement in Harris's direction over time. But it's really it's that stasis that I think is what gave me last week when I introduced last week's episode, kind of like, are we done? Are we done yet? Can we fast forward to November 5th and open the package and see what's inside? And your point too, the calm before the storm, because like all of this stuff is happening, and yet the polls, which as imperfect as they are really our only way to, anything metrical, anything outside of our heavily infected with hopes and fears, vibes and everything. That's something we can look at. That is something at least outside of us, and they're not really changing, even though you got Trump saying his stuff and Harris saying her stuff, and you've got this debate. So I do think that is part of what that's about, right? Because it's not like oh, there was Kamala, crushed Trump and she went ahead 8 points, but then, there was Springfield and everybody got upset at Haitians, and then Trump went ahead, and you're like, oh my God, it's bouncing back and forth. Where's it going to end up? Like, those things happen, but the polls didn't really move.
Yeah, exactly. And then so you're dealing with that reality layered on to kind of the scar tissue we all have from the past two elections, which, tell you that something that happens in the last couple weeks of the campaign, e.g. the Comey stuff, could doom her, right? And then you have to be worried about that. And then you have the 2020 scar tissue of, well, they overestimated Biden an awful lot that time. Margins are as close, if not closer this time, could be disaster.
Closer.
And then you have the reality of what we're looking at now, which is it's been a truncated campaign cycle of extraordinary events. And we seem to be in the same place as we were before. So I think all that kind of just adds up to the stew. And we do want to segue into another part of the race, which is the push to hold the Senate in the worst map of all time. And for a long time in this campaign, I mean, I can't tell you how many pitches from, the campaign or the national organ saying, our map is big, right? Like, we're fighting in Texas and Florida too. And the rule of thumb when people say that is, okay, how much money are you spending there? Because you can say it till you're blue in the face, but if you're not going to put down buku bucks, particularly in these two incredibly large
Very
and expensive
states, yep.
You're not really playing for it at all. But they've kind of put their money where their mouth is in these last few weeks in a seeming attempt to hedge on Montana. They're now putting serious money in a late game push for Colin Allred and Debbie Merkersel-Powell. And what's kind of most interesting to me about this is if against all odds one of these Democrats wins, and just to note, this morning before we started recording, Cook Political report did shift the Texas race in Democrats' direction, but from kind of likely Republican to leans Republican.
Let me ask
But
you a question. Did that make it? Were you able to see where they have the Florida race? Did that just bring it into alignment with the Florida race?
so they have Florida as still likely Republican. So they just moved the Texas
That's
one
interesting.
alone.
That's interesting. That surprises me a little. And they know these things more than I do. So I'm that's surprising to me.
I know, me too. I mean, because obviously Ted Cruz is odious, but I feel like we've had enough data by now that doesn't seem to perturb Texans all that much.
Oh yeah, it's funny because I looked at this a few days ago, just kind of tried to dig in a bit and look deeper and look at some poll numbers and money numbers and stuff. And my takeaway was actually that notwithstanding the fact that both of them are very challenging, that Florida looked a little more promising to me than Texas. And that is a mix of things. One is that Florida's just closer. Like it's like, Democrats have, there's so much psychic damage for Democrats over Florida. They have sort of read Florida as now like a deep red, hardcore conservative state. And it's trended that way. But we got to remember, it was considered a swing state until like a cycle ago, basically. It's a little, just the top of the ticket is a little closer. The actual Senate race is a little closer. But the big thing that jumped out at me was, I have several sort of axiomatic doctrines that I operate by in politics. And one of them, which is a very solid one, is everybody hates Ted Cruz, because everybody does hate Ted Cruz. And I and my wife and friend set have a little experience of this because we actually went to college with Ted Cruz, and my wife actually was in his year. Everybody hates Ted Cruz. Every point in the life story, everybody hates Ted Cruz. But what I was actually surprised to see is that his approval numbers in Texas are not that bad. They're like in the mid, even high 40s, right? So he's, I think the big poll crunching sites, I couldn't find a full data set of his approval numbers, but I found a few over the course of last year. And again, he seems to be a bit above water, mid high 40s, which in this era is not too bad. Rick Scott is down in the mid 30s. That is totally different. So I was sort of still operating on the idea that the Cruz election situation is one in which, even his supporters don't really like him very much, but it's a Republican state, and that's going to kind of bring him over the finish line. But that's not exactly it. Again, his approval numbers are not too bad. So the idea that, that made it seem more challenging to me. Colin Allred, I think, is the perfect candidate in that state. We all know that Beto O'Rourke back in 2018 made this very hard run at Cruz. I think in a lot of ways he ran a great campaign, but he lost. Obviously, he brought in a huge amount of money, and in retrospect, and I think Allred is definitely has adopted this viewpoint. I think the verdict on Beto O'Rourke's campaign is you just cannot run a nationalized resistance campaign in that state, and that's what O'Rourke did, and it didn't work. So Allred is definitely kind of not doing resistance Twitter. He's just kind of like a normal Texas dude who's running for Senate, and that's a different go at it. But yeah, I'm not trying to throw cold water on this. I think it is, I'm not quite sure I'd say it's a long shot, frankly. It's definitely really challenging. It just, again, when I looked at it, I was a bit surprised that there seemed to me a bit more of an argument for vulnerability for Rick Scott than Cruz. Having said that, the Cook Report people know this stuff better than I do, so I'm curious. I'm curious what they're thinking. You know, the thing with Rick Scott is always I don't know if Scott is literally a billionaire, but he's close enough. He can put any amount of money in, and I don't know if that's the idea, because the sort of the conventional wisdom, and Democrats, you can pour in as much money as you want, but Rick Scott's ready to match it if he thinks it's necessary. But not everything comes down to money, in the sense of the side that spends more does not necessarily do better. Sometimes you just need enough to get your argument out there. So what is your? I know that you have sort of Florida, Texas PTSD about this, but what's your overall take?
Honestly, what I'm most interested in is whether this late infusion of money can make these races even close, kind of much less win. Because I think one
Mm-hmm.
of the biggest things we're waiting to see from this election cycle is this a grand experiment that's teaching us that you only really have to campaign at the end of the campaign, because the people who decide elections aren't paying attention until then anyway? Like, I mean, that's the whole Kamala Harris experiment, right? Can you
Mm-hmm.
campaign for 3 months and still win the presidency? Like, that would be a huge thing to know. And then in these Senate races, can you not put in money until the last month and still, kind of end up more or less where you would have if you contested the whole time? I mean, that's unknowable to some degree, but if one of these races, let's say, comes anywhere close to Beto's margin with Ted Cruz, right? Like, let's say under 5 points, I think that would be a pretty compelling argument that you don't need to do that much until the late stretch. And I think that could like kind of profoundly reshape how elections look in this country, right? I mean, you had Biden on the air by himself for months and months and months, and it did not change a single thing. So that's what I'm kind of most curious about in these kind of late breaking states, especially because the conventional wisdom there is, it's so expensive. You have to have an expansive ground game. You kind of have to recreate what Democrats did in Georgia, and you need to kind of reinvigorate the party and rebuild the infrastructure. And if it really comes down to just kind of you dump a dump truck of money in at the last month and you get up on all the TVs and you're the freshest thing in people's minds when they vote, I mean, that could really kind of change the dynamics.
Well, one thing about campaigns and the campaign, let's say before the summer, right, when you're really very early, people aren't paying attention. Generally speaking, if you're the incumbent, and if you're the incumbent and it is at all a race, one of the things you are trying to do is disqualify the other person. You and that is definitely what that's definitely what what John Tester was trying to do with that Sheehy guy, to basically kind of in advance just sort of like destroy him on the launch pad, to just say, look, we're not even going to get into like whether you'd like a Democrat or Republican or even how much you like me. This guy cannot be Montana senator. And he was not able to do that, clearly, by the fact that Sheehy now seems to be ahead. So that's one reason you do things early, because if you're the challenger, you need to be the conventional wisdom, at least, is that you need to be on the air to prevent that from happening, right? So I mean, there's all of these different factors in play, and I don't know. It is hard to say. Some of this is the polarized age in which, both candidates are guaranteed 45% of the vote, even in a red state, right? So who knows? Who knows? I mean, a lot of the discussion about these two races has I've seen some people say, you know, kind of, oh, they always fall for this. There's no hope and whatever. But I mean, again, sort of like, I don't know the point of those comments, because the Democrats' goal is to hold on to the Senate majority. And you have to say, at a minimum, you cannot rely on John Tester to make that happen. It might happen, and I don't think that race is over, but he is definitely the underdog now. So you've got to go to the next closest race. That's just how it is, right? I mean, and so there's no like being naive or throwing money away. I mean, what are you going to, you know, what are Chuck Schumer and the senator from Michigan, who is so low profile? I'm forgetting his name at the moment.
Gary Peters.
Yes, Gary Peters. What are they going to do? Just say like, okay, I guess we're not going to be in the majority.
Right.
Maybe
exactly.
we'll, you know, maybe we'll give this money away to charity or give it to Kamala or what? I mean, of course not.
Right.
You're going to spend
Who
it,
has
and
$1 billion on hand by this
yeah,
point.
who has unlimited money. I will one last thing on this that I think is worth considering is that in all of these races where a Senate Democratic candidate is trying to beat a Republican in a state that is going to go for Donald Trump, generally speaking, and each state is different, there's a conventional wisdom about, you know, maybe Kamala has to keep it to within 5 or 6 points in Texas for Allred even to have a shot, right? And there's going to be something comparable in Florida. And so I wonder whether you're going to see some action on the presidential front to try to make that possible. Because on the one, obviously, Kamala Harris has to win her race, right? I mean, kind of everything depends on that. But it's not like this is charity for her. If she does win, having a Senate majority, even a tiny one, is transformative for her presidency. It's not going to be a fun presidency if you've got, I don't know, Rick Scott or John Cornyn or whoever who's just kind of, you know, saying nothing is going to pass the Senate and no Supreme Court, you know, no judges or whatever. So I'm curious what is going to happen on that front, whether they think, and here again, I would think, especially in Florida, it's a question because, you know, last point here, I do not expect Harris to win Florida, but it's a 4-point race there. And like, you know, Michigan at various points has been a 3-point race. That's not that far, right? So you could see them making some kind of push in Florida, not probably because they think they're going to win it, but again, it's zero sum at some level, and you want to put the other side on defense as much as possible. Anyway, all these things could conceivably come together.
It's interesting. Either way, it's interesting to watch. It's interesting to see how it plays out. And to wrap this episode, we are going to do a quick little corner on the indictment of the political official who you would probably most suspect out of everyone to be indicted, like apart from Trump, which is Eric Adams, the New York mayor. Probably one of the weirdest officials we've kind of ever had on a big platform. Was indicted for fittingly weird things, basically kind of like small bore corruption with the Turkish government, kind of a rigging of New York's public financing scheme to make up small donors so he would get those multiplied funds, and doing weird favors for the Turks, like, you know, approving an embassy building that isn't up to fire code, and then in exchange getting really nice seats on Turkish Airlines and staying in the Four Seasons in Istanbul, and just a whole kind of panoply of bumbling kind of comical criminality, much of which was carried out over text. And we know that because these texts are reprinted in the indictment, where something's like an Adams aide will be like, don't forget to delete this stuff. And Adams is like, oh, I already do, So it's, I saw like a right winger tweet that's like, well, it's not so funny when a Democrat does it, is it? Or, when a Democrat gets indicted. And it's like, no, it's really funny. It's definitely really funny.
It is. This one, I feel, as you say, I bring it on. I find it hilarious. I do find it a little embarrassing for America as a country because it's so small bore. Like the Turk. I mean, kind of a little help with the fire code regulations at the embassy. I'm like, man, this is like, I'm sure you can just bring it up to code, right? I mean, it's like and the one thing I did notice is that they got Adams to not put out a statement on the anniversary or the sort of the commemoration day of the Armenian genocide. That is a very big deal to the Turkish government, always has been. So that doesn't surprise me. Having said that, I don't think they're really going to live or die. Who even knows what the mayor of New York says about the Armenian genocide? I mean, it's like it certainly was a big deal, certainly to the Armenians and the Turks, that Joe Biden earlier in his presidency, officially put the U.S. government on record recognizing the Armenian genocide. That's a big deal. The mayor of New York putting out a press release, that's not a terribly big deal. And so, yeah, like you can just imagine, and again, this isn't like, I'll sort of tweak our publisher, this isn't like Cleveland, right? This is New York City. This is in many ways the capital of the country, right? And I can just imagine the Turks thinking like, yeah, just tossed him some like hotel, kind of some frequent flyer miles, man, and we own him. Like, it's pathetic, and like it's so weird. And like for Adams, like, dude, you got elected mayor of New York City. Like, that is a big deal. And even in the most transactional sense, dude, just even be a one-term mayor, and you can be like on corporate boards, and like, dude, why did you light yourself on fire and quite possibly go to prison for so little? It's just it's weird. It's weird.
And it's weird that the corruption-y stuff started when he was Brooklyn borough president, which is like maybe a significant role from a like municipal standpoint, but it really does leave you with the impression that the Turkish government, and I'm sure other governments, are just kind of splashing low amounts of money around to see if someone might end up kind of being helpful later. But I think the funniest thing about all this to me is Adams is really Trumpian in the sense that you just get the impression that neither of them really understands what corruption is. Like, they both are kind of like, yeah, I mean, obviously Adams isn't admitting this and Trump doesn't either, but you get the sense that they're both kind of like, yeah, well, why be in power if you're not going to kind of make these little
get the
deals?
benefits of being in power.
Right. Like, they fundamentally don't kind of have the moral compass to like understand that public service should be devoid of kickbacks, right? It's not in their worldview. And I think it contributes to their parallels in terms of lying in baffling and easy to catch ways, right? I mean, with Adams, it's everything from, oh yeah, I do live in this apartment, and then reporters go into the apartment, it's like super obvious no one is living there. Or yeah, I'm a vegan, and then people see him eat chicken. It's like, it's this weird thing where you want to win every interaction, and the truth is so inconsequential to you that you kind of say whatever feels best, even if you're creating your own scandals for like objectively stupid reasons. You know, like who cares if Adams is a vegan or not? And this does, it feels of a piece, right? Because you asked a good question. Why in the world are you going to jail potentially for like a few $10,000 from the Turkish government that's mostly been given to you through airline tickets and hotel rooms? And I think it's just because he, like Trump, it wouldn't occur to him that like, oh, this is kind of bad behavior. It's just kind of like, well, this is politician behavior, right? This is the behavior of a man in my stature who people want to do nice things for. And he's like, well, yeah, I'm going to do that. So there we go.
Yeah, it's I think we all know, because you see it somewhere, sometimes in the popular culture, that celebrities, when they go to Cannes or when they go to the Tribeca Film Festival, there are all these brands throwing things at them and goodie bags, and unlike when us normal people go to a goodie bag and you get like a lanyard and and maybe like a keychain, their goodie bags have like watches and stuff, and that's just kind of being a celebrity, and kind of like, okay, I'm just I'm just a movie star. People can give me presents, like, why not? And I guess so. You are a movie star and people give you presents, and that's just how it is. And it you do get the sense that guys like this, uh that's kind of how they see it. I'm I'm a movie star, and people give me presents, and why wouldn't they give me presents? And the public service thing doesn't quite, you know, uh, that distinction is sort of lost on them. And the funny thing is that when you're a politician, you get a lot of presents.
Yeah.
You get a lot of presents that are okay. Like, you can't keep them, but I mean, even you know, let's just take someone who I think is pretty clean and we all know about, Kamala Harris. She's flying on her own plane. She's going to nice restaurants, right? So, and we don't expect a presidential. I mean, one of the things they use the campaign donations as, we need a plane. We're flying all over the place. It doesn't work for us to be, to be flying coach, and we're not just going to go to McDonald's. We're gonna have caterers and stuff. So you can actually live pretty large, like, legitimately. It's just, kind of, there are certain things, and even like with the, staying at a nice place, somehow or another, when a mayor of New York goes to Turkey on a trade mission or whatever, right? An official visit, something like that. They don't stay in a Motel 6 in Turkey. They stay in a nice place. I don't even know who pays for it. City of New York pays for it. Maybe the host pays for it. As long as you don't have texts saying like, saying like Ahmet saying, Eric, we need you down at, there's a fire marshal down here at the embassy who's totally busting our chops. We need you to come down here and work this out for us. And he's like, okay, I'll be there. I'll be right over. As long as you don't have those texts, it's all okay. So, like,
Yeah.
why?
I
I just don't get it.
The celebrity giveaway comparison is perfect because both Adams and Trump, the only part of being politicians that they seem to like is the celebrity part of it, right? The kind of, you get to brush shoulders with other famous people of all different types. There's trappings, there's pomp and circumstance. Like, we know Adams in particular, we know from his love of saying, Istanbul is the New York City of Turkey. He said that with every single country and a big city in it. Like, he loves saying that. And we have this compilation of him saying this because he loves to go to, like, Turkish Heritage Day in New York and kind of put in an appearance and get to make a little speech, and everyone's excited that the mayor's there. Like, he is in pictures with a shocking number of celebrities who are now, in jail or facing legal troubles because he just likes being with celebrities. Like, that's a part of the job that he really enjoys. So it kind of makes sense that both he and Trump are such easy marks for these adversarial countries, because it never occurs to them to kind of question the quid pro quo of it all, because they're like, first of all, I don't care about like doing favors for my friends, for people who like me. Second of all, yeah, people should be kind of dumping gifts and money and nice airline tickets in my
Like,
lap,
why
because
else did
that's
I
my
become mayor
job.
of New York?
That's the whole
Like,
point.
yeah, I mean, I won, so I get the presents. Like, why would I
Yeah,
have run if I didn't want the presents?
exactly.
Right. Yeah. So it's, like, but this is, it is, well, I'm curious. You used to live in New York. I think you've been in DC for like almost 5 years now, going on 5 years,
That's
something
right.
like
Mm-hmm.
4.5 years. And, before Adams was indicted, a friend of mine was saying, when it was, when the sharks were swirling, right, and there was all these raids and other people were getting either charged or whatever. It seemed like it was coming, and this person asked me, like, why isn't this getting more attention? Like, what? Like, yes, it's being reported, but this is like the mayor of New York City, and it's clear that there's like a major federal criminal investigation, and kind of it's not just not getting that much attention. And what I told them, this person, is I don't think anybody's that surprised. Right? Like, if you saw Kamala, if it's a year from now and you saw Kamala Harris and you're like, she was, I don't know, there's this big executive and whatever, some big thing, I think a lot of people would be, wow, I'm stunned. Like, what happened there, right? But with Adams, I think most people were like, okay, yeah, I kind of figured he'd get indicted. So it's not
Exactly.
it's not a huge surprise. And then the other thing is, I don't think anybody really cares. He doesn't have. I do not sense there's no hardcore base of his support, of people who are like, dude, no way, you're not going to take down Eric.
Yeah.
I can't allow it. It's just no one
I
feels
mean,
that way.
wasn't his approval ratings was like in the 20s pre the indictment? So, I mean, he was pretty clearly doomed to be a one-term mayor no matter how this shook out. But kind of the only piece of intrigue now, besides how the whole case plays out, is that I guess Governor Kathy Hochul has the power to fire Adams, basically, to fire the mayor of New York. And then you would have the public advocate step in, which would be fascinating because New York's public advocate is, I mean, significantly to the left of Hochul, who is kind of
Yeah.
one of these machine politicians, like much
Yeah.
more from the same kind of part of the Democratic Party that Adams is, even though, his route was not super typical, but they represent the same kind of politician.
Yeah.
So that would be kind of fascinating if she would be willing to do that, knowing that she's handing the keys over to someone quite progressive, even
Yeah.
though stakes are low on all of this, right? Because when the election's next year, right, there are just a few more months on this term anyway. So, I mean, the whole thing is just, you're right. I mean, it's funny, and I have enjoyed it, and I do think it's been a nice little amount of levity kind of in our current political atmosphere. But yeah, it's embarrassing. I mean, get this clown off the stage.
Well, the thing, I think someone said that this is the first time a sitting mayor of New York has been indicted, or maybe in a very long time. It is sort of, as it often is in presidential administrations, it's sort of a feature of the New York City mayoralty, or whatever, however you pronounce that, that often after someone has been around a while, it certainly happened with Ed Koch, happened with Giuliani in a different kind of way. But over time, you start getting scandals, right? That people start cashing in, people start doing bad things. But in most cases, and seemingly almost in all cases, the actual mayor is not, like, the mayor can take a hit because they're supposed to run a clean shop, but the fact that no one's been indicted is that no one can catch the mayor doing something with their actual hand in the till, except now, right? I mean, it is just it is weird, and I do. It was interesting to me that the governor can't fire the mayor, and I guess it's just like they don't have to get the legislature in the mix. The governor can just say, "Dude, time's up. You're done. You're out." So I do get the sense. I don't think, I don't know if she's really eager to see Jermaine Williams be mayor of New York, but I guess we will see, because he does seem pretty caught dead to rights.
Yeah.
I think.
I mean, I don't think there's a lot of people out there being like, when Eric beats the charges, I think it's pretty obvious that Eric did the charges.
Right. And again, and not a, yeah, it's, well, we'll see how it plays out for Mr. Adams.
Maybe future Republican candidate Eric Adams. Honestly, it's not that hard to see it.
Future Trump pardonee.
Oh, for sure.
Eric Adams. Sure. That's a good route to making the party switch. Yep. Right. So yeah, you can definitely see that. Okay. I think that's all we got for today. Anything else?
That's all.
All right. Talk to you next week.
See you next week.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.